idea, all this sort of stuff. We won't talk about everything that's there today, but we'll save some stuff for next week. I'll try to lay out sort of the issues we'll talk about next week. What I want you to read for next week is a preface to the second edition, as you'll see. It's just 11 pages, but, juicy, good 11 pages. He wrote it in 1831, as I mentioned before, so about a week before he died, actually. So it's one of the last bits of writing we have from him. So I think it's useful to look at that for a host of reasons. We'll take a look at it for several reasons. And we'll talk about that mainly next week. Those of you who are working on your papers, which all of you should be working on your papers by now, and many of you have talked to me, if not all of you at this point, don't forget that the final paper is due on March the 26th by 11:59. There's a D2L folder dedicated for that. So, 26, no later. Don't ask for extensions. Just whenever you have by the 26th, submit it. That's a simple answer, right? You can send me the panicked email at 11:30 that night. What I will say to you is, send me whatever you have, whatever condition that is in, whatever it looks like. Send that, right? Because something is better than nothing. I didn't say that. That makes it true. But maybe it's better. I don't know. It's something. That's good. All right. I think that's it. Questions or issues, problems for me? Things you want to come back and talk about? All questions have been solved, right? At this point, no, not quite. All right. So what I want to do today is begin by coming back to three concepts that we talked about over the last session and the session before that, before we lead into the discussion of absolute person, which we mentioned last time, and then to method, which we'll be spending the majority of our time about today. Those three concepts are truth. These shouldn't be a big surprise. I just want to review them. Truth, life, and cognition. Just that. So truth, life, and cognition. And with life, we'll be talking about, of course, the genus process. So life and the genus, because they go together. So we think so. So I want to spend a bit of time reviewing those concepts for just a moment, because they obviously lead us into the final chapter of the book, chapter 3 of this section. And they're all where the book is culminating in a certain sense too. And then just coming attractions, one of the things we'll do today is we'll look again, that's what this thing is up on the screen, we'll get to that in a little while, about just what is the concept, right? Is me kind of tracking it across the subjective logic. What does it all mean in each one of those sections? So we'll talk about that a little bit. And then after that, we'll take a look at the master argument of the entirety of the logic, right? So we looked at the master argument of objective logic before. Now we'll look at the whole thing all the way together, all the way through subjective logic. And I posted those on D2L. All right. So let's talk first about truth. So I said last time that Hegel has an unusual conception of truth, right? And we explored that a little bit, and we really explored it around this question. We said that if the concept is the constitutive process, which is what we've been trying to argue, or what I've been trying to argue that the concept is for Hegel. If the concept is the constitutive process that produces all that is, then how can it be truth? How can we think truth, if it's to be understood as a constitutive movement, as freedom? How can we understand truth as freedom? And Hegel's claim, as we saw, is that truth is the idea, where the idea is defined as the agreement of cognition with its object, the agreement of cognition with its object. So if you sort of extract that out, it sounds like your standard correspondence theory of truth. It's intellect in accordance with the thing, right? That's how it works. But then he says, and that's on 523 if you want the sort of citation where that definition is from. He then on 673, so 150 pages later, he says, well, it's more properly understood as the unity of subjective concept and objectivity. Now, at that point, right, we know what subjective concept means. It means not subjective me, individual. It means subjective concept in the sense of the formal concept. It means the concept in the sense of the conceptual determinations, universality, particularity, singularity. It means in terms of the judgment forms, in terms of the syllogistic forms. That's what he means. And he means that is the unity of that with objectivity, by which he means the mechanistic layer, the chemistic layer, and ultimately the teleological layer of objectivity. So that's his way of saying all of this is culminated, right? All that argumentation, that unfolding of the concept has ultimately culminated in the unity of those two moments together. And that's, he says, what we mean by truth. So he says on 745, just to push it one bit further, this is 745, the first lines of the last paragraph. This is 246 in the German. He writes this. Now the negativity just considered constitutes the turning point of the movement of the concept. This has been sort of the mantra we've had all the way through. The concept is determinate negation. It's always about negation. It's always about othering. Process of. It is a simple point of the negative self-relation, the innermost source of all activity, of living and spiritual self-movement. It is the dialectical soul that everything true possesses. There's that notion of truth. I just wanted to highlight that invocation of that notion of that when we're talking about the movement of the concept, we're talking about what makes things true. And that doesn't sound like, well, true in the sense of, well, my intellect is now corresponding with the object. It's not that sense of truth, obviously. And through which alone it is true. So now things are true by virtue of this process, this movement going on. And then he says, for on this subjectivity alone rests the sublation of the opposition between concept and reality. And the unity of subjectivity and objectivity, concept and reality, that, he says, is. So we said last time that Hegel doesn't hold to a correspondence theory of truth in a kind of classical sense, right? He holds to what is categorized, I think, properly as a material form of truth, an ontological form of truth, where something is true to the extent that it is true to its concept, and better said, true to the concept, right? Not just its concept. So this book isn't true because it matches up with concept of book. That's one sense in which material truth works. But it's the thing in accordance with the concept, right? Not the intellect, but in accordance with the concept. But it's really in accordance with the concept, this process, this movement. So it's in accord with it, which means it's in accord with it not only as exemplifying what it is to be a book, but exemplifying what it is to be a moment in the process by which books and all other things are what they are. So truth then is the creative constituting movement of negativity, what Hegel also called freedom, whereby the concept, subjectivity, and reality, objectivity, are both constituted, and it is that which establishes their fundamental unity, their accordance, or their congruence, their unity. Now, if that a preliminary sort of description of what Hegel means by truth makes any sense, then that returns us to, and we've talked about this before, I just want to come back and rehearse it briefly, these two locutions that we constantly see Hegel talk about when he talks about this process theory of truth, right? Which is, one thing is the truth of another. He constantly says one thing is the truth of another. And then he will, and we've talked about that before, but I do want to come back and talk about it again very briefly, just set the stage, really set the stage for the second thing. And that's where when he says also that one thing is the other in its truth. In its truth. So think of him, he's constantly said things like, the concept is the truth of essence. It's the truth of essence. It follows it, but it's proven to be its truth. And so then he would say, he'll flip that right around and say, well, what that means is that the concept is essence in its truth. So it's, in a certain sense, something is not itself alone. It's itself in virtue of the process that it's but a moment of, and it's thereby completed in something else that is its own determination, but it's a further determination of it that follows necessarily from it. So focus on the truth of locution for just a moment. To claim that Y is the truth of X, to say that the concept is the truth of essence, is to claim that Y, here, the concept, is the imminent and necessary result. Hegel means by that what follows from or is entailed by the unfolding of X, in this case essence's, own determinations. And it's that X's retrogressive ground. It's what makes possible X itself, right? Here, essence. So, you can always say, well, what's Hegel's theory of essence? You could say this about being as well, but we'll stay with essence. What's Hegel's theory of essence? Well, Hegel's theory of essence is that it's not itself. Right? It necessarily others itself and becomes itself only insofar as it is concept. So this is one of the struggles we always have with Hegel, right? We want to fasten him down and say, well, just give us an account of this one thing. And I admit my own frustration with this as well, right? You'll open Hegel up and you'll say, well, I'd just like to get his theory of X, whatever X might be. And you'll go in there and you'll start reading about it, pick out a chapter and say, well, I'm going to read Hegel on mechanism. I'm going to read Hegel on form and content. I'm going to read Hegel on quality, whatever you might pick out of there. And as we all know, we've all found this to be true after 20 weeks of doing this. We know this intimately. Then every time you do that, he's constantly telling you, yeah, that thing is itself, not itself. Right? Precisely in being itself, it's not itself. It others itself. And because it others itself, it's really itself in the other thing, right? So the form is what it is in content. So content is form in its truth, right? But it's the truth of the form, if you want to put it in that way. Essence is not in itself what it is. Concept is the truth of essence itself. So we can then say that when one thing is the truth of another, it means three things all at once for me. It means that concept, just to stay with that relationship, concept and essence, but this holds for any of those, one thing necessarily entails another relationships. When we say concept is the truth of essence, concept is the truth of essence, we mean that concept integrates the conflicting terms that defined essence, sorry. It integrates those conflicting terms. Things like the essential relation, the absolute relation. So that's the first thing it means. It integrates those conflicts that defined the preceding concept, preceding category. Stop with concept. That concept embodies, the second thing, that concept embodies or realizes what X strove to be but could not be as itself. Right? So it's what essence entails itself to be but is unable to be itself. And then importantly, so that's the first two layers of this. The third layer is that the concept does not supplant what is true in essence, doesn't supplant it, doesn't do away with it. Rather, concept takes up and preserves what is true, it sublates it in what's true in essence, while canceling, here's the moment of Hegel, while canceling the fixity, the rigidity, the staticness that made essence, in this case, ultimately untrue to itself as a process. So notice, I think this is really important insights. The reason why I want to come back and emphasize this a bit is that Hegel's claim is not that something is false. So that whole account of being, that whole account of essence, we don't go back and look at that and go, well, those are massive failures. They should have moved on to the concept. Right? There's where truth lies. Well, in one sense, yeah, that's where truth lies. But those other things are not false by virtue of that. Being is not false, essence is not false. Why? Because they define themselves in certain ways, necessarily did so. That's what we were doing, unpacking them. They entail something beyond themselves, and yeah, that means that their truth is not lying within them, but that doesn't mean that they are false, rendered false thereby. They have a moment within this process that they mark. They're moments of the process. That is their status, right? They're not false. They are not the complete truth. So you could call them untrue, but untrue measured against, held against the standard of process. Right? Fixed unto themselves, they're untrue, right? If you hold on to them, this is the only way, something is quality. That's all it is. Something is quantity. That's all it is. Something is measure. That's all it is. And so forth throughout the rest of the logic. You could say, well, on their own, right, if you isolate them, they are untrue to the process that demonstrated repeatedly to be going on. They all entail going on within them. It's only when we reach the concept as idea that we get something that's true to itself as process. Hence, its status as true to itself in a way that being is not true to itself, not able to be true to itself. Essence is not able to be true to itself in essence. So the process theory of truth then says it's really born in that locution of saying, well, one, in this case, the concept is the truth of. That truth of locution, the concept is the truth of essence, is really bearing out that moment, that mark of saying these things are what they are only in the process of what they entail, what follows from them. Now, that leads me to the second locution. So that's the truth of, right? One thing is the truth of another. The other thing he will say less frequently, he all the time is saying one thing is the truth of another thing. But he will come to this other way of expressing himself. And most particularly, you hear it most often in the subjective logic, right? Where he'll say one thing is the other thing in its truth. One thing is the other thing in its truth. That means that when you say that Concept is essence in its truth. The concept is essence in its truth. It's what essence truly is. It's to claim that the concept is the complete and utter determination of what essence is. So if you want Hegel's theory of essence, you want Hegel's theory of being, the ultimate answer to that is the concept, right? Because that is being and essence in their truth is the movement of the concept. Now, unto themselves, they don't show that directly, right? They unfold and necessarily entail that. That's the flow of the logic overall. But on their own, they entail what comes next, right? Quality entails quantity, quantity entails measure, so forth and so on. But what they are ultimately pointing to is that they are moments in a process. That process is ultimately the movement of the concept. So, we are not entitled to say on any page of the logic that the concept is doing the work here. Until we get to that point where the concept is now rendered explicit and we can talk about the movement of the concept itself. So none of the stuff in the objective logic can we say, well, secretly, surreptitiously, the concept's at work here. Becoming, right, being nothing but becoming is already the concept. Now, on retrospective view, of course that's what that is. But that's only because we've earned this conclusion that we've only now reached, which is that the concept, we're about to hear it in this final chapter, the concept is everything. Literally, the concept is everything. It's the process that engenders everything that is, being everything, insofar as it is what it is, essence. John?
So just a quick clarification.
Yeah.
What are you saying exactly we can't say? Because, like, I said retrogressively it is the concept, but what are you saying we can't say?
We can't say when we're reading through the logic. It wouldn't be a genuinely immanent reading of the logic. If we started off the logic by saying, being nothing, becoming, well, you know how you get from being nothing to becoming is because the concept is already there at work. Determinate negation is already here at work, and that's what's entailed us to move to becoming. That would be the intervention, right, of the end in the beginning. And Hegel's about to say, if you didn't catch this, you'll hear me emphasize this, that he says the beginning doesn't, when he's talking about the method, he says the beginning never flows into its progression by overflowing from itself. It doesn't do that way, right? Because that would mean that the beginning already contained everything and it's just flooding out with all the stuff that's already there. What he says is that it moves, progresses, by virtue of determinate negation. That's immanent, unfolding, othering of each moment of itself. So we're not entitled to say, when we look at being nothing, becoming, or anything else before the doctrine of the concept, that the concept's already at work there. Now, on retrospective view, of course, that is the case. That's what he's claiming right now. But we're not entitled to that claim until then. That's the point.
Okay.
Other comments, questions about that? So the concept in its truth is a specific kind of movement, what he calls freedom, the self-differentiating, self-determining process of a determinate negation that produces all that is, being in essence, and does so by virtue of being the unity of subjectivity, formal concept he means by that, and objectivity, the real concept, as he calls it that. The concept is adequate to itself. It is in its truth. Only when it is objectively free, objectively self-causing, generative, self-realizing, where the objective realization is adequate to, it's congruent with the structure, the formal, subjectivity. That is what he means by the idea. So the idea is the concept in its truth. So truth for Hegel is not, we've been here before, just want to reiterate it, is not an ought or a goal that is to be approached asymptotically or otherwise. That is, truth is not for Hegel a standard, a regulative idea in the Kantian sense, that is to be approximated as an always elusive beyond. Instead, the truth is the congruence of concept and reality. A reality that does not correspond to the concept is mere appearance, he says, something subjective, accidental, arbitrary, something that is not the truth. So to be in the truth is to be in this process. And to be lacking in the adequacy to that process is to be untrue, to be finite, to be restricted. To be fixed in that is to be false. There's where you have falsity. So we can speak about degrees of truth in Hegel. Do we have an account of reality in the doctrine of being that's true? Yeah, to a degree. Do we have an account of reality that's true In the essence, yes, again, to a degree, to a different degree than that of being. But the one that's true to it to the highest degree is the idea. Hence the claims about the idea being the pinnacle, the foundation of everything else that is to be examined. So if we can speak about degrees of truth in that way, we can also speak about degrees of untruth. So you can say about the various moments in the doctrine of being, the doctrine of essence, you can say, well, those are true, but they're ultimately not the highest degree of truth. So they have a degree of truth, but they also have a degree of untruth about them. And when we fixate on them, and they allow this, right? So this is not a mistake we simply make. We do make this mistake, but it's a mistake that's allowed by the nature of the formal, abstractive nature of all categories in Hegel. When they're fixed in this way, then they become rigid, then they become false. Okay? So think about truth in this way, right? It's not as simple as, did I match up with the state of affairs or not? Did my proposition match up with the state of affairs or not? No, this is about the material ontological notion of truth, process notion of truth in Hegel's case, where it's trying to really think truth as this movement where it's never adequate to itself until it's come into full self-relation, which is what you only have. And then the formal concept and the real concept are shown to be one with one another, which is the idea. Now, that's really what I wanted to remind us about truth. People want to come back to that. That's a very odd notion of truth. And it makes for challenging ways in which you can talk about, well, is this statement in Hegel's logic true? And just think about that for a moment. His account of, you fill in the blank, his account of whatever. And you want someone, to address the question, well, is that true? Well, if you go the propositional route and you say, well, is it an accurate depiction of the state of affairs that it's trying to capture? Then, yes or no, okay? It gets at it the way, but all that's going to be a matter of assessment about, here's the state of affairs as they show themselves, here's the way this concept does or does not get to that, form and content don't work that way, the inner and the outer don't work that way, substance and causality don't work, that'll be the issue. But if what you mean by truth is that, propositional truth, then you're always going to have this external measure that you're trying to get the logical categories to match up to, or they're going to fail to match up to. Now, I'm not saying you can't do that. You absolutely can do that. Okay? And in some senses, will be called upon to do that in various different contexts. Absolutely the case. So I don't want to save Hegel from those questions. Okay? But we also should be mindful of the fact that Hegel's account of truth demands something more and other than simply that kind of evaluation. His account of truth says, well, it's true insofar as it entails this, and that other thing is really what that thing is in its truth. So let's look at that claim. Because it's not about an external state of affairs, it's about these concepts that entail one another. Now, the danger with that, of course, let me just acknowledge the danger with the way I just described using Hegel's theory of truth to talk about the various categories in the logic. The danger with that, of course, is it then begins to sound like it's just a bunch of categories that entail one another. And if they entail one another, good, they're true by virtue of that. And that sounds like a suspiciously coherentist conception of truth. All the various categories entail one another, so they form this beautiful, maybe not so beautiful, but they form this wonderful system that all entail these categories, and that's where we're left. Now, and that's coherent. That's coherentism, right? It's a way of thinking about coherentism. If all the things can be shown to be compatible with one another, then they are mutually reinforcing, then we have a coherentist theory of truth. And a lot of people will say, see, now we can finally find a way of putting Hegel into one of our standard conventional boxes. He's not a correspondence or a propositional theorist of truth. He's a coherentist theory of truth. But as we know, these categories aren't just, abstract categories. These are supposed to be, this is the claim from the very beginning of the book, the nature of reality itself. So these aren't just a set of categories. You can abstract them out and treat them that way. But they're not supposed to be just a set of categories that we can see, are they congruent with one another, are they compatible with one another, do they cohere with one another or not. We're actually talking about the structure of reality itself. So these aren't just categories that cohere with one another or don't. This is the nature of reality itself as it relates to itself. So that's a different way of thinking about that, a different standard of measure by which you can talk about that truth. And in that respect, I don't think Hegel really fits into the coherentist model at all. He famously this is in the encyclopedia, criticizes the coherence model himself, right? Because he thinks that it's abstraction, then coherence is really not the matter itself. The matter itself is whether it actually captures the nature of reality or not. All right, so that's roughly Hegel on truth a bit. Does that make some sense? I just wanted to bring some things together I said last time and expand on them just slightly. Questions about that, issues? Now let's talk about life and genus. I'll be brief about this again. So Hegel contends that it is only in and through the activity of reproduction that the class of which the living individual, the organism, what he calls the idea in its immediacy. He says it's only in that reproduction that the living individual, the organism, is a member, or better, it's a specification, a particularization of its genus, where that genus is made actual. So reproduction, this is the crazy things that we say at the end of the logic, but it's what's shown. Reproduction then is the concrete, that is objective expression of the movement of the concept. It's the movement of disjunction, the universal particularizing itself, the genus particularizing itself, and thereby becoming individual. That's what's going on in reproduction. So copulation is for Hegel the concrete actual process of which the disjunctive syllogism is the formal expression. No, that's the way that has to work. Here's the retrogressive ground of that, not the reverse, right? So it's not everything must be a disjunctive syllogism. I found one over here in the copulation, right? It's exactly the reverse. Copulation is what it is. It's this genus particularizing itself in individuality, and we capture that formally in the disjunctive syllogism, with the middle term being a concrete universal. Hegel literally thinks that the objective is the retrogressive ground of the subjective in this sense. So he says, this is on page 688, that is to say, the process of the genus, this is 191 in the German, the process of the genus in which the single individuals sublate in one another their indifferent immediate concrete existence, and in this negative unity expire or die away, extermin, has further the realized genus. This is what's really going on there. It's not about the birth of the offspring, right? It's not about the reproduction of literally this individual or this species. It's about the reproduction of, or particularization of the genus itself, the actualization of the genus. So he says, still on 688, in copulation, the immediacy of the living individuality perishes. So this is the point, right? I'm not writing the logic to ultimately tell you what, the concept is a living organism. Literally, that's not the relevant matter there. The relevant matter there is that the living organism is a figure through which the concept as genus realizes itself. So in copulation, the immediacy of the living individuality perishes. The death of this life is the emergence of spirit. First time we hear about spirit in this book, right? Read a whole book about it previously. Here's the first time we hear spirit in the book. The idea which as genus is implicit becomes explicit in that it has sublated its particularity that constituted the living species. You also, this is Geschlechter, so you could hear that as the living sexes, and has thereby given itself a reality that is itself simple universality. Notice its universality, concrete universality. Simple universality means it concretizes itself. Thus it has the idea that relates itself to itself as idea. So here's the genus now that relates itself through copulation, relates itself to itself. And he says, the universal that has universality for its determinateness and existence. So now it's explicitly what it was only implicitly in the living organism. Well, what's that? He says, well, that's the idea of cognition. That's what cognition is. And we talked about this last time. We're about to talk about it again. Cognition for Hegel is not a mental process, or not that exclusively only, or even principally, certainly in the logic. It's a process that goes on within reality itself, just like reflection did. So we've seen that also with copulation. We see that here with the process of cognition. So he says on 689 now, next page, the concept is as concept for itself insofar as it freely exists as abstract universality or as genus. As such, it is its pure self-identity, which inwardly differentiates itself in such a manner that the differentiated moment is not an objectivity, but is likewise liberated into subjectivity, or the form of simple self-likeness, and hence the object of the concept is the concept itself. So this isn't a repetition of, oh, it becomes objective now. It's already objective. So what it concretizes or realizes itself as, determines itself as, is itself. Becomes the concept realized itself. Well, that's the idea of cognition. Here's the logical idea of life, necessarily entailing the logical idea of cognition. So just to briefly remind ourselves about what we did with cognition last time. We said that cognition is, let me do it this way, contrastively. If life is the urge to differentiate, this compulsion to differentiate itself and thereby create the genus, particularize itself, then cognition is a striving, not an urge or impulse, not a tree, it's a striving. It's a striving after something. Now to realize itself in objectivity again, to know itself there now rather than just be it, and to bring that reality into, or objectivity, into accord with itself. So it's a twofold striving. It's a striving after the true. That's the theoretical component of it. This is what he calls cognition, right? But then it's also striving after the good. It's a practical striving as well. He says on 696 now, this is 198 through 199 in the German. He says, although the idea is indeed the free concept that has itself for its object, it is nonetheless immediate. And just because it is immediate, it is still the idea in its subjectivity. So subjectivity always marks here in Hegel a limitation of where we're at. It's still yet formal. It's the way you can always hear that. Certainly in the logic, it's still formal. How's it formal? It's formal in that it hasn't proven out to be everything that exists and shown that to be true, and hasn't shown all of that to be good. So he says, and hence, it is still the idea in its subjectivity, and hence in its finitude, its limitedness in general. It is the purpose that ought to realize itself. So here we come back to the structure of ought, striving after what it ought to be. Or it is the absolute idea itself still in its appearance, not yet in its manifestation, still in its appearance, Bashana. So in both theoretical and practical striving, spirit is confronted with an independent, or the concept is confronted with an independent existence, objectivity, that it strives to bring into accord with its own immanent structure, namely the structure of the concept. It tries to prove out that everything is a disjunctive syllogism. Accordingly, the activities of the theoretical and the practical striving differ, at least initially, they won't ultimately, but they do initially, in terms of their object and the way they seek to bring about this reconciliation between subjectivity and objectivity. In the striving after the true, he calls the idea of the true, we're trying to know, or the concept is trying to know objectivity, to know objectivity in its truth. It does that initially by breaking it down into its parts. That's analytic cognition. It then tries to bring those parts together synthetically through definition, that is to subsume all the singular moments that has been broken down under a universal category and a universal class. It then tries to divide them back out, show how they specify back out from that universality, how they specify back out. That's what he means by division. So definition is the covering concept, bring everything under the one concept. Then we divide it back out, show how it has this proliferation. But the problem, of course, is that proliferation is willy-nilly and arbitrary without it having a principle. That principle turns out to be, surprise, surprise, determinate negation. And only when we have that do we have something's not, we don't have its definition, we don't have its division, we have something more fundamental than either of those. We have its, what Hegel calls its Lehrsatz, its theorem. I always think about this, this is an aside, but I think it's worth kind of, maybe it'll be useful to do a comparison here. This is, Hegel gets to theorems at the end of the logic, right? That's what's just happened, right? Hegel gets to theorems at the end of the logic. Theorems are the principle by which things are fully explainable, right? So that's, if you want to know what Hegel thinks you've got to have in order to have an understanding of something, an account of something, you've got to have its theorem. And that means you've not only got to have its definition, you've got to be able to explain how it divides out, and you've got to know the principle of that division itself. That's the theorem. And to me, for Hegel, that's supposed to do the work that he thinks Spinoza's axioms don't do, but are supposed to do. So if you think about the ethics for just a moment, right? Maybe this is the obscure by the obscure, and I apologize if it is. If it doesn't work for you, just toss it. You can do an analogy with something in Plato, right? Plato will work as well for this as well. But, in the ethics, right, when Spinoza says, well, here's an axiom, and he's got this, the mora geometrica, right? It's all operating by the geometrical method. Well, in geometry, you just have axioms. And they're true by virtue of their axiomatic status, and then you derive things from them. And that's precisely what the ethics is. Here's all these axioms, book 1, book 2, book 3, all the various books have different axioms. And then he just appeals to those axioms and shows, what those axioms thought together or even thought individually entail are these various things, this proposition, that proposition, that we derive from them. And that's how you derive the metaphysics that's there in book 1, for example, book 2, all the way up to the ethics that are there in book 4 and book 5, right? So that's the way those axioms are supposed to work. But Hegel's looking at that and saying, number one, what gives them their axiomatic status? Well, Spinoza has an account of it. Intuition. That's the account. It's the third form of knowledge. He says we know things through direct experience. I'm paraphrasing massively, so please. We know things directly through experience. We know things through reasoning about that experience, and we know things directly through intuition, third kind of knowledge. All those are forms of knowledge for Spinoza. He tells you this late in the book, or late, something like that. I forget where it is. Anyway, so now you know where the axioms come from. The axioms come from intuition. You know these things directly because you grasp the world this way. Schelling loves this. Lots of others love this because it's acknowledging, because it's an acknowledging of you can't deliberate about first principles. They're manifestly true in and of themselves. They are self-evidently the case. We hold these truths to be self-evident, right? That kind of thing. That's really, we hold these axioms to be self-evident, and these things follow from them. That's really, you could say Spinoza's in effect saying that at the very beginning of, I always tell my students when I'm teaching it, Spinoza's in effect saying, here's some things that are self-evidently the case. You might think they're strangely the case, right? Not self-evident at all, but he thinks they're self-evidently the case. And then here's what all follows from them, given the axiomatic truth value that they already sustain. And Hegel's theorems are his replacement for those axioms. Hegel's theorems are his replacement for those axioms. You don't get them through intuition. They are 690 pages hard won, because you're not entitled to them until they're shown to be a feature of the nature of reality itself. That's what this is, right? This idea of cognition. It says now the concept strives towards truth, and because it strives towards truth literally out there in things, we can then, as finite beings, try to strive after that truth as well, follow the concept. And how do we know when we got truth? Not when we intuit it directly, self-evident, but when we've given an account of something whereby we've not only said, well, here's what its definition is. So there's the, Socrates always wants the logos. What's the definition? Hegel says, yeah, you got to have that, but that's not enough. What else you got to have? You got to have how this thing actually differentiates itself. Oh, okay, so we have to do a little Aristotle, right? We have to now do a taxonomy. We have to not just have the genus, we got to have the species differentiation. So Porphyry, thank God, came along and gave us all these wonderful trees where we can divide everything out in the specific differences, and we now know how everything goes. And we're good categorizers, taxonomists of being is the job of a metaphysician post-Aristotle. But Hegel, of course, wants to push you one step further. What's the principle of those divisions? Where did you get specific difference? That can't be just something you either A, intuited, or B, asserted because you observed it. Well, this thing's not like that thing. That's an empirical observation that holds literally no status of necessity. It may be an incredibly important observation if you're a farmer trying to grow different crops. Right? So I'm not saying that kind of empirical knowledge is not incredibly valuable. It is, immensely so. But if you're trying to do philosophical knowledge, that is to know things as they are in truth, and that means to know them in their necessity, that empirical knowledge will never measure up. Hume was right. You really can't have that kind of knowledge if you're just going through observation, if you're just going through how things show up for us, how things present themselves to us. That'll never work. But as Kant told us, right, you got to rise up to something more, synthetic a priori judgments. Well, theorems in Hegel is, as far as I can tell, his replacement for axioms in Spinoza, the logoi in Aristotle and in Plato, or synthetic a priori judgments in Kant. It's the highest form of knowledge from which all other forms of knowledge would derive. So I've never seen this done, and I'm always hesitant to do it myself because frankly, I don't think I can bring it off. But it seems to me that reflexively means, for reading the logic, reading the whole of the system, frankly, so this would be true in the philosophy of nature, philosophy of spirit as well, is that if Hegel has got a category, it's derived from prior categories, it entails other categories, yes. So it has its place in the systematic train. But also it has to have, as a moment of that philosophical system, it has to be able to play the role of a theorem. It has to be not only for other sciences, lower level sciences, it has to not only be the definition of them. What is it to be a form? It's this. All other forms will have to abide by that in order to be a form. How will they proliferate out? It's got to be there in the form itself. Well, that can't just be willy-nilly. It can't just be arbitrary. It gives rise to a bunch of different kinds of forms. No, it's got to have that principle within itself. Well, that means that has to be a theorem as well. And that has to be true for, I think, every single category in the logic. So the theorem idea, I think, reflects back on every moment within the logic and says every last one of those moments, when we were talking about reality and its other, that can't just be an analysis of those concepts. It is, of course, that. And at that moment, that is exactly what it is. But at this moment, you've got to realize, well, that can't just be all that it is. And for it to count as genuine knowledge, for it to be even a degree of truth, to put it in the language we were using just a moment ago, it's got to be a theorem as well. And that means it's got to have both the moment of definition in it, the moment of division in it, but most importantly, the moment of the principle of its own definitional completeness and divisional specificity. Now, that makes some sense. There's a lot, there's a whole account of how Hegel's categories are supposed to operate. So that's, and not just their derivational status, but their status vis-a-vis the other sciences. We're going to come to that in just a moment, where he talks about how the methodology of the concept envelops the other sciences. What are the other sciences? How's he thinking about that? More about that in just a moment. But that is part of the role that I think the logic, and frankly all of them, are supposed to play, the philosophical sciences play with respect to non-philosophical, let's call them generally, broadly, empirical sciences. And he says that the idea of cognition is not only about the true, the highest moment of the true is the theorem, but that's the concept trying to accord with and trying to capture fully objectivity. But objectivity also has to accord with subjectivity. Objectivity has to accord with the concept. And that means it has to not only be true in itself, but it has to be good, valued by the concept itself. And so Hegel says that this practical striving follows from the theoretical striving of the concept, and they match one another, they mutually reinforce one another, so that he claims on 733 that what is good must be true, and what is true must be good. What is true must be good. So the object of theoretical striving, the true, must be one with the true, what is good, which is the object of practical striving, and the reverse, the good must be the true. He says, this is on page 734, 235 in the German. If you want the parallel for this, I haven't done this very often, but it's worth sort of marking this because they both are kind of culmination moments in the logic. If you look in the Encyclopedia Logic, this is paragraph 234. So 234 is the parallel for this in the 1830 edition of the Encyclopedia. He says this on page 734 in the Logic. Accordingly, in this result, that the true is the good and the good is the true. In this result, cognition is restored and united with the practical idea, the good. The previously discovered actuality is at the same time determined as the realized absolute purpose. no longer an object of investigation, a merely objective world without the subjectivity of the concept, but as an objective world whose inner ground and actual subsistence is rather the concept. So there's that moment, right? It's not, it accords with the concept, it is, it's identified with it, it is the concept itself. He then says, this is the absolute idea. Now that's what we got to last time, right? He says on if you back up quite a ways, this is what he's already called on 670, this is 173 in the German, he calls the objective world, the true, whose inner ground and actual subsistence, practical idea, the good, is rather the concept. He says that's a concept in its full determinateness. So the concept in its full determinateness is not living individuality, it's not life, not logical life. It's not cognition as it strives after the true, not cognition as it strives after the good. It's the realization of those moments, which is mutually dependent. You can't have the true without the good without the true. He says the concept in its full determinateness is it's coming into itself in and through its othering of itself. That's the absolute idea. That's what he means by the true as such, the objectively true, what he also calls, for shorthand, the adequate concept, the concept that is adequate to itself. So now we've gotten to the absolute idea, and I pushed us over to this material that we read last time about this kind of grand soliloquy he gives at the beginning of the absolute idea chapter, where he says things like the following. This is on 735 now. We read these last week. The absolute idea has shown itself to be the identity of the theoretical and practical idea, each of which, of itself still one-sided, possesses the idea only as a sought-for beyond an unattained goal. Each is therefore a synthesis of striving, each possessing as well as not possessing the idea within it, passing from one thought to the other without bringing the two together, but remaining fixed in the contradiction of the two. So they get caught up in themselves. But then he says, the absolute idea is a rational concept that in its reality only rejoins itself, only comes back to itself. It is by virtue of this immediacy of its objective identity, on the one hand, the return to life, so it is life as well, but on the other hand, it is equally sublated this form of its immediacy and harbors within itself the highest opposition. So it's this process now again, and it has these two moments, the true and the good. Now, then he introduces this controversial language we talked about last week, the notion of personhood. Let's just follow this through. Again, 735. The concept is not only soul, so we've been there with life, right? It's not only the soul, it's not only the driving trieb, it's not only the driving desire, urge to differentiate. He says, but it's free subjective concept that exists for itself, that relates to itself. It's explicit, relates to itself explicitly. And therefore has personality, Persönlichkeit, the practical objective concept that is determined in and for itself, and is as person impenetrable atomic subjectivity, but which is not just the same exclusive singularity. So, that's as we talked about last week, that's one of Hegel's giving and taking, right? That's where he gives you the concept and says, you all know what this is, right? I mean, this is personhood. We all know what personhood is. We've read on Kant, right? The world's divided up into two categories. It's either a thing or it's a person. And things don't merit respect. Persons do. There you go. They're objects of incredible dignity and worth, absolute dignity and worth, intrinsic value. There's the Kantian notion. So Hegel's pulling that. He's going, yep, let me take that. That's right. That's the kind of status that we've shown belongs to the idea. It's paramount. It has intrinsic value and worth. It's the true, but not just the true, it's also the good. Not a good, but the good. It is intrinsically valuable in and of itself. So he wants to take that term, a moral laden term, and use it to mark the status of the idea, the status that the idea has been shown to merit by virtue of its derivation from life and cognition, from being in essence. But then he gives you that little proviso. He says, but which is not just the same exclusive singularity. So there's the giving something but then taking it back away. Because you thought, oh, now I get it. It's a person. And as we talked about last time, the right-wing Hegelians would say that person is God. The left-wing Hegelians would say that person is humanity. And off they go. And as typical for Hegel, He may allow both readings in some sense. They can both grab hold of that. But what they both miss is what he took away from them. Right? So he's always middle Hegelian. Right? He's neither a right-wing or left-wing Hegelian. Pretty true of Hegel in general. That's what that removing of it's not an impenetrable atomic subjectivity. It's a universality, he says. How is God a universality? How is humanity a universality? Well, they're universalities because universality has a status unto itself. So to say that it's defined, that the idea is defined by personhood, is not to say that it is a person, be that a divine or a human, all too human person. It's just to say that this is the status of universality particularizing itself in the singularity, that process. That's the status that it has reached. So it's not an exclusive singularity. It's not this individual, whether that this individual is this God being. That's a being. Nor this person known as humanity. That's a this being as well. It's that process. That's exactly what he's giving you, but then taking away that this moment where you try to stop it and say, oh, it's just the culmination of that. It's just the result of that. It's just what it ultimately reaches. It's just the this of singularity. He's saying, no, precisely not that. It's the whole of this process itself. And that process, of course, is also universality, and there is no universality without particularization. So we're talking about concrete universality of that process. So that leads me to talk a little bit about what does it even mean by concept? Because we've come a long way with this thing since when we began this quarter talking about, okay, the whole book is ultimately about this thing known as the concept. And we said the concept is not your garden variety standard conceptual concept. We're way beyond that at this point, we know. Concept designates or denotes a process of determinate negation by which everything is what it is and is at all. That's a shorthand definition of what the concept is. I don't know if that's a theorem yet, but that's at least the definition. But track it through here, right? If you think about it in each moment, if you look at the subjectivity and concept, judgment, syllogism, what was the concept? It was singularity, ultimately, but that was a form of objective universality. Remember, singularity doesn't stand on its own. It is the fulfillment, the completion of this process of universality particularizing itself. So that's what we meant by the concept there. It's predication, right? We're already getting this notion of S is P, predication. So it's there in the copula there already. We come back to copulation at the end. Copula there, right? It goes to this predication. What are you predicating? The genus. Now you predicate that genus as inhering or as subsumptive or as determinative. That's what we began to work with in the judgment forms. But that is nonetheless what the concept is there. We can go back and see it there. The concept is, finally, in syllogism, is this inference. It's the middle term that makes possible the inferential networks. It really is that disjuncting process itself. We saw that worked out in objectivity. Here now we're moving from the formal concept to the real concept. We saw it in the law that governs mechanism. The weird center of mechanism that is no center. There's no central object. It's the strange thing about that account of mechanism. Everything's centered towards something that's not something unto itself. It really is just constantly, it's a law, right, that takes this moment of directing them in that directs them back out. Right? It sets them separate from one another, but it sets them in relation to one another. So it's law, but in chemism, we now see it integrated within them. It's the activating principle. It's what disrupts every dissolution of them into a neutral compound. It breaks them up in some kind of way. And then we see it standing on its own in teleology as an extrinsic purpose or end that stands over against objectivity, as we know. The extrinsicality, of course, becomes the problem in teleology. And the only way in which it's undermined is to show, well, wait a minute, that which we're trying to impose the end upon is itself already been created by the same concept. So it doesn't have to be violently imposed upon it at all. It is itself already it. It is the life, soul, urge, organism, ultimately the genus now again, not as a logical concept, but as a life concept. Here, logical life. Here we have it, the concept is the striving, knowing and willing in cognition, and then ultimately we come back to it in personhood. So what I would suggest to you there is that Hegel is going into each one of those domains, whether it's the subjective logic of judgment and, of concept, judgment, and syllogism, whether it's the objective concepts of mechanism, chemism, and teleology, or now in the absolute idea where we're talking about life, we're talking about cognition. Each one of those, he's trying to mark out the movement of the concept and what status is it now at. So this introduction of person, logical person, no surprise here, just like it was logical cognition, just like it was logical life, is really the marking of a status, more so than it is the denoting of its intrinsic nature, if that makes some sense. I struggle with how to get at this, but I think that that's roughly right. That personhood, Persönlichkeit in Hegel, in the logic here, he uses it differently in the philosophy of right. We can come and talk about that another day. But here it means very clearly, if there's anything clear in the logic. I think what it means is that there's a status that the concept now enjoys that it had not enjoyed before. It was not entitled to it. What I've tried to do here is reconstruct the pathway of its attaining different levels of status. And what it's doing in each one of them is being raised or deepened in its standing vis-a-vis objectivity. So it's one thing to think about the concept as abstract or external in kind of way, formal, which is what we're doing in subjectivity, to think about it as real, which is doing what you're doing in objectivity, and to think about those two moments thought together. How do you think the formal, inherent within, immanent within the real itself? And that's what life and cognition and ultimately now personhood are all trying to mark. Personhood is the name for the concept in its truth, in objectivity itself. And then, the soliloquy begins, right? And the business of philosophy is to talk about that. And that's Hegel's way of saying, right? We have now reached the absolute. We now know how things are in their truth. He says at the beginning of the phenomenology, the ambition, I'm paraphrasing, this is the beginning of the introduction of the phenomenology. He says, the ambition of consciousness is to know things as they are in their truth. Not just to know them as it takes truth to be. That would make him a pragmatist. He's not. That would make him a relativist. He's not. He wants to know things as they are in truth, not relative to consciousness. That would make him also an idealist. Subjective idealist. He's not. So what does it mean to know things in their truth? He's paying off on that now. 700 pages later, but yes, or 1,100 pages later, depending on how you want to count things. He's finally paying off and saying, now you know things in their truth. You know them in their truth when you know them in the idea. That's what it means to know them in their truth, to know them in the idea. Now he says, this is on page 735, the beginning of the second paragraph. We read these last time. It, the absolute idea, qua personhood, that's what he's talking about here, is the only object and content of philosophy. If you're not talking about here, you're not doing philosophy. Since it contains all determinateness within it. I mean, what else is there to talk about? I mean, that's what philosophy's job is, to find accounts for determinateness. That's what its job is to do. And its essence consists in returning through its self-determination and particularization to itself. So there it is, it's a process, clearly, that process. It has various and diverse shapes, Gestaltung. And the business of philosophy, its job, it's what it does, is to recognize, or kennen, to recognize or know it, the absolute idea, in those shapes. So this is why, frustratingly, right? So let me acknowledge that. But this is why Hegel will say, okay, you want to do an account of nature? We need to know nature in its idea. Our idea about it? Nope. Nature in the idea. What the hell does that mean? Minimally, it means that nature is pure externality. Where'd that come from? A lot of things to talk about there. When you want to give a political philosophy, he says, great, wonderful, no problem, let's do political philosophy. Let's talk about right, because that's the central political concept. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about it. That's the central thing. Right or justice. We're good. Let's talk about it. So what does he start off that book with? The idea of right is. Now, if you hear that in a kind of standard vernacular, our conception of it. But that's not what he means. He means this. He's doing philosophy about, it's a philosophical science of right. And the philosophical science of right means you're talking about right or nature or spirit or whatever. You're talking about it in the idea itself. That is, in this process. So there's a wonderful moment in the philosophy of right. I think it's wonderful. Maybe you don't. But at the beginning of the philosophy of right, where he says, this book is about the idea of right. And then he gives you, the dashes, right? The function of these dashes again. And he gives you the dashes and he says, he gives you a short definition of it. He says, that's the concept and its actualization. The concept of right and its actualization. Now, a lot of exegetical ink has been spilt on what the hell that's supposed to mean, right? And how we're supposed to read that. There's plenty of different ways of reading that actualization claim. But I would submit to you one way, maybe the way he's suggesting here, is that you have to read it as, the concept others itself and thereby generates its own determinations. Not it gets actualized out in history, or it gets actualized in culturally or something else. So then he says, nature and spirit are different modes of the existence of this movement, while art and religion are the different modes through which this process depicts itself. Hegel thus refers to the derivation of these more concrete domains as the further business, right? So we've already got the business, now we know the further business of the particular philosophical sciences, plural. So the science of logic is related to these other sciences, the sciences of what we pretty quickly will recognize as the philosophical science of nature, philosophical science of spirit. So he draws a distinction between the particular philosophical sciences. Notice we're all still at the level of philosophical sciences. We haven't got to natural, empirical, social sciences, none of that. He thus draws a crucial distinction between what he calls the particular philosophical sciences, the philosophy of nature, mechanics, physics, and organics, the philosophy of spirit, subjective, objective, and absolute. He draws a distinction between that and the science of logic. And this is what we were talking about a little bit last week with what's the relationship between the three parts of the system, right? He comes back and thinks about this at the end of the encyclopedia. We talked about that a little bit last week. I don't want to get lost in that again, but look at what he does say about it here. This is on page 736. This is worth paying a little close attention to. So 736, about 3 lines from the top of the page, sorry. So 3 lines down from the top of the page. 736. The top line on page 736. Also, the logicality of the absolute idea can be called a mode of it. You see where I'm at? So he's using this mode language to mean there's different domains, there's different ways in which these things, so mode is a way, modus, a way of these things, person that is the idea, the absolute idea, gets expressed, talking about in the philosophy of nature, philosophy of spirit. But then he says, also the logicality, so this book, the logicality of the absolute idea can be called a mode of it. But mode signifies a particular kind, a determinateness of form. So that's what you could say, that the philosophy of nature is a particular kind, a particular form. Okay. Science of logic is basically the same thing. No, he says, look at what he says. Whereas is the distinction here, the logicality of the idea is the universal mode. That's weird. So you could talk about the way things are natural. That's a mode of the philosophical science. Given an account of that would be a mode of the philosophical account of nature would be a mode of that, right? A determinate mode, particular mode. Same thing you can do with the philosophy of spirit, right? It's a mode in which the absolute idea as person expresses itself, presents itself. So you want to know what the idea of spirit is, like you want to know what the idea of nature is. So those are, as he says, a particular kind, a determinateness of form. But then he says, whereas the logicality of the idea, the science of logic, this project, is the universal mode. So it has a broader status. That's what universal seems to indicate here. It's scope. Right? The others are particular mode. They're circumscribed. The philosophy of nature is just about things insofar as they're natural. The philosophy of spirit insofar as they're spiritual. Well, the logical is not just about things insofar as they're logical. It's about everything. Because it's an ontology versus a special metaphysics, right? It's an ontological account of the nature of reality as such. He says, whereas the logicality of the idea is the universal mode in which all particular modes, I take that to mean all other sciences. Here's the relationship between science of logic and the philosophy of nature and the philosophy of spirit. All the other particular modes are sublated and enveloped. Now, that's tantalizing more than informative, right? He seems to be asserting some kind of priority of the logic over and against the other parts of the system. That seems to be the case here. And everybody who loves the logic runs to that and says, right there it is. There's the hierarchy. The science of logic stands supreme, right? It sublates and envelops all the other philosophy of nature and philosophy of spirit. So that's the architecture of the system. That's where it all ultimately is, here's the dangerous word, subsumed under the logic. But we know that can't be right. That would be an inadequate way of understanding the relationship of the logic to those other moments, because it's not an abstract universal. It's a concrete universal. It specifies them. It doesn't subsume. Then he says this, and we're going to come back and look at the rest of this paragraph line by line in just a moment. I know there are questions. I'll cover those, but I just want to begin this. From that, he then says, the logical idea. So now he's focused. So he's been broadened out to say, let me talk about the whole system for a moment. What comes from this? We've gotten to person now. Everything is really about that. If you're not doing that, you're not doing philosophy. And so doing that in all of its different modes, say the modalities of personhood, are doing philosophy. But then he wants to come back and say, okay, well, what is this book doing vis-a-vis all those others? Oh, it's the enveloping, sublating, universal mode for all those other things. What in the world is that? What is this? And his answer, as you can see, and you can sneak a peek right already at the end of that paragraph, is it's the method. So that mode language, right, modos, the way, is laying up the methodos, right, laying up the movement to the methodology. And something is being said about the priority, clearly, of the logic vis-a-vis the other sciences, which are particular domains, where the logic is not a restricted particular domain. And what that is and how that works is what he's about to try to lay out in this paragraph right here in the middle, which I always love, I'm fascinated by, but I'm never sure I really understand it. So that's why we're going to spend some time. This is for me as much as it's for you. Sorry, I'm putting you through my own problems. That's what seminars are for. Not quite, but maybe a little bit. So I'm trying to figure out what's going on in that middle paragraph. So we'll come back and talk about that. But that's when he says that it is this uttering. It is the original word. What does that mean? He's clearly struggling with how to characterize the logic, the logos, right, over against phusis, it's Geist in Greek. Suke, yeah, of course. So that's what he's trying to line up. I should think those two. All right, there were questions. John, do you have? Mm-hmm. Yeah, please.
Yeah.
Sorry to make you wait so long.
No, it's all good. One quick question is just the word personhood. That's you translating the German word Persönlichkeit.
Yeah.
Because in the English it's personality.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes much of a difference.
Yeah, that's that's Miller's translation of it. The new De Giovanni translates it as, well, he does it personality as well. I'm sorry. I thought he translated it as personality.
Yeah.
Personality I hate. As a translation of
different. Yeah.
Personality is something that you have as a feature of your subjectivity. It's too ephemeral to capture what Persönlichkeit is trying to get at. Personhood is abstract. Personhood doesn't tell you anything in English, right? Nobody says, "Oh, I was thinking about my personhood today," and you all go, "Well, yeah." But when you say his personality is weird, or that person's got a kind of strange personality, you know what they're talking about. I mean, roughly, and it's just not getting you the same place, right, at that point. So Persönlichkeit needs to be personhood, right? Just to preserve the oddity of the German at that moment. Right? Now notice, as I talked about last time, Persönlichkeit is a term that was being picked up and used from the Kantian context of Person, right? It's picking up from there and being expanded to be used in a theological context, right? So Kant had already started this in Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone. Right? He's starting to talk about religious doctrines in terms of God as person. So he's already exporting his own moral language and practical language, let's call it that, into the religious or theological domain. And theologians reading Kant are taking it over and start thinking about the standard account of the three persons in one of the Trinity, for example, in the Christian tradition, to think about it in those ways, right? So they're trying to rethink personhood in those ways. And Hegel's clearly trying to recapture the notion, recapture is probably not the right term, capture the notion and have the status of intrinsic value retained that it had in Kant, but not have all the baggage of its humanistic or theological determinations come with it. Of course, it is worth noting that, as I mentioned, that's what happened, right? The split happened over, well, what is the absolute idea? It's personal. So what's person? Well, it's either all of us human beings or it's God, right? So there's the right and left wing Hegelian break. So not successful. And also not successful in trying to avoid that dichotomy. But also worth noting that I don't think Hegel ever goes back to that language again. It's here. And I don't remember him in the encyclopedia ever going back to this language. Outside of the discussion of abstract right in philosophy of right, he does use the term person there, but it means us there. Right? So it is clearly about us there. But he doesn't go back to this language ever again, as far as I can tell. But what it does here is this, right? It denotes a status that it has, that it doesn't enjoy when it's just singularity or law or so. Or,
yeah, no, that's really another question.
Yeah.
So it does appear in mechanism, Persönlichkeit.
Does appear what?
It does appear in mechanism, Persönlichkeit.
I didn't remember. Where's it there?
The formal mechanistic process.
Yeah, what does he say there? I don't remember.
636.
Okay.
He talks about I had no idea what he meant by it. He says, but also it's atop of 636, but also in the communication between material objects does their determinateness widen, so to speak. In an equally idealizing manner, personality is an infinitely more intensive hardness than objects possess. So if we're not entitled to talk about it in mechanism,
Yeah.
then what's the status of him talking about it? Is it then just simply an example, and does he mean Persönlichkeit then in a different sense than in the absolute idea?
I'm going to say yes to that because look on the previous page. He's talking about the notion of communication, right, in mechanism. And then he wants to give examples of what communication is. So he says, let's talk about spiritual communication. Right? So that's what he immediately starts doing. So these are examples of what we're looking at in the abstractly mechanistic account of communication, which applies to all sorts of cases, not just matter in motion, but also communication more broadly. And then that's exactly what he's doing. He says, but also in the communication between material objects, does their determinateness widen, so to speak, in an equally idealizing manner. Personality is an infinitely more intensive hardness than objects possess. So now we're talking one person to another, right? Spiritual conversation. That's what he's talking about. Communication with one another. So he's saying communication happens at all these different levels, and that's the mechanistic process of work. It's an example. I don't think it's doing any deductive work.
Just to make sure I understand, it's logical there, and like an example of like you're talking about literally people.
Yeah, people.
Not using it in the sense of the absolute idea.
Just like he will in chemism say the chemical processes are love, human love. Right? The affection we have, the affinity and the dispersal we have in the chemical process. One level of that in which that's expressed, in which that's illustrated, exemplified is human love. Mm-hmm. Right? So he's always trying to show you that what looks to be traditionally and exclusively natural scientific concepts are ontologically not restricted to that domain alone. That they have a spiritual dimension in this, and they have a spiritual dimension there that you might not expect, but they exemplify this same process because the ontological process undergirds all of them. It's not just a natural scientific concept. It's there in the natural scientific as well, right? But it's not exclusively.
Yeah, and that was clear when he talks about Personen, but like when it's Persönlichkeit in that way, then it was confusing for me of, okay, does he mean now this in a much different sense than we would normally use it, but not there?
Yeah, no, I think he is using it in the common sense. He is saying it's really hard to, get into someone's personality and communicate with them directly, right? So it's to pierce them. So I'm fine with personality being used for Persönlichkeit there. But when he uses it in the other place, I don't think it's proper use.
Yeah.
Even though De Giovanni wants to say consistent, I think it's not right to stay consistent.
Okay, thank you.
That's a good question.
Yeah,
Does that help with that?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I'd forgotten about that. Like I forget about a lot of them. Good questions. All right. So here's the question I want to ponder with you for just a moment, and I'm sure I'm right on time. Yeah. So give me just a little bit of time here, and then we'll take a break after we go through this. So I'm going to look on page 736 again. So come back to 736. 237 in the German. And just walk with me through these lines, and let's try to make some sense of what he's doing here. He says here, I'm looking for it. Let me see if I can match it up. Okay. Yeah, so I'm wrong. So if you look on the next page, right, look at 737, 238, German. Here's what he draws out of this discussion that we're about to examine in some detail. So this is, kind of our standard how to read Hegel, right? Read him and then go back and read what he thinks he accomplished, and then go back and try to figure out if that's what this all did in some kind of way or another. It's at least an attempt to try to understand what's going on. First, let him interpret himself in a certain sense, then judging by whether he actually does succeed in it. So he says here on the first paragraph down on 737, 238 in the German, accordingly, what is to be considered as method? So that's what we're going to get to. We're going to get to the logicality of the idea as method. He says, what is to be considered as method here is only the movement of the concept itself. That's all we're going to be talking about, right? Because that is everything. And then he says, in case you hadn't gotten it yet, he says what I take to be the conclusion to the logic. This is, the short version of what's the logic ultimately demonstrate. He says this: we already know the nature of this movement. Right, we've been through it 1,000 times at this point, right? We've seen it in its formal sense, we've seen it in its objective sense, we've seen it as it played out the formal in the objective. Right? That's life and striving. We've seen all that. He says, but it now has first the added significance. So what it didn't have then, but that it has now. Here's another point about its status. We've been talking about the movement of the concept repeatedly. But what it didn't have and it didn't enjoy as its status then, but it has now, is this: that the concept is all. The concept is alles, everything. And that its movement is the universal absolute activity, the self-determining, self-realizing movement. Now, I take that to be what the logic has argued. Everything else is recognition of that and trying to understand. That's what the method really turns out to be. It's trying to capture that and mark that. Because if that's right, that's an ontological claim, right? Then the way to know everything is to know it in those terms. Because that's the truth of everything. And that's how we'll know it in its truth, by knowing it in accordance with that. So the method then flows out from, as he says, accordingly, what is to be considered as method here is only the movement of the concept. Why? Because the concept is everything. Everything is, insofar as it is, it's the movement of the concept. So to know it in its truth is to know it in accordance with that. All right. So now back up and look at the preceding page, 736. And take a look, I'm 4 lines down. This is just where we dropped out earlier. So this is just after he's made this. It's the universal mode in which all particular modes are sublated and developed. The 4th line down. The logical idea is the idea, we see where I'm at, the logical idea is the idea itself in its pure essence. So not like in nature, not like in spirit. That's the contrast still at work here. It's the idea in its pure essence. The idea that is enclosed in simple identity within its concept and in reflective shining has as yet to step into form determinateness. Now, this is a point we'll come back to next week, right? It doesn't have form determinateness. It's got a lot of determinateness in its form. Why hasn't it stepped out to that? Well, we're going to see that means something else, right? It means nature. He says, the logic thus exhibits the self-movement of the absolute idea only as the original word, which is an Ausrufung. So this is a wonderful word for Hegel to invoke here, right? Because it means both uttering, it's what you're saying, what you're uttering, but it also means Ausrufung, means othering at the same time. It means both of those. So what is the original word? To other. So he's mimicking the language of, what is the logos? What is the logos? Beginning of the gospel according to John, right? The logos, trying to think about that. He's mimicking that language. He's saying, here's what the logos is. The logos is the movement of the concept. I know what the freaking fourth gospel tells you. I've read it. But, this isn't about the logos that came down and tabernacled with us. This is about the movement of the concept that made that story necessary. There's the relationship between philosophy and religion, right? Same object, different presentations. One of necessity, this. One of narrative contingency, the Christian story. That's one example. He then says, but one that in being externally uttered has immediately vanished again. So it becomes other than itself, and then it others that otherness. That, of course, is determinate negation. The idea is therefore only in this self-determination of apprehending itself. So there's no idea outside that process. The idea just is that process. It is in pure thought where difference is not yet otherness. Now, that's a powerful line, because what that means is that we've been dealing only with it in the domain of thought. Not that thought is extrinsic to being. Thought and being are one. That's where we started. That's where we remain. We're still there. But it doesn't yet have this sense of alterity, of otherness yet. He's setting up the nature problem. That's what this is, right? That science of logic is not yet the philosophy of nature. So it's not yet in its otherness. Though it's been uttered, it others itself, it's not got that standpoint of otherness where it is the idea in its externality, in its otherness, which is what nature is. So he says, where difference is not yet otherness, but is and remains perfectly transparent to itself. It comes back to itself. It's not yet going through mechanics and organics and physics that we see in philosophy of nature. Now, he wants to focus in on what does it mean to talk about this logical idea itself? What does it mean to talk about the idea? Persönlichkeit, right? Idea in its logical mode, which is a universal mode. It's unlike the particular modes of nature and spirit. But what does it mean to even talk about that? So he says, the logical idea thus has itself as the infinite form for its content. So now he starts doing this in terms of form and content. And he's making this odd claim. He's about to make it in more substantive terms. That what's been at issue throughout the logic has been the form of all things. Well, if you stopped at that moment, you'd say, well, that means that we've got an abstract account of everything. Now we know what it means for it to sublate and sublate all other things, is that it gathers them all into itself because it's the form of them, but all the content really comes from outside of it. Look at what Hegel says about it. The logical idea thus has itself as the infinite form for its content. Form that constitutes the opposite of content, inasmuch as the latter, content, is the form determination that has withdrawn into itself and has been so sublated in identity that this concrete identity stands over against the identity developed as form. So now we've come to a point where we're talking about the form, the concept. And it's been shown to be in objectivity, but it's been shown to be that which posits, that which produces, that which creates objectivity itself. So now it's the identity developed purely as form. The content has the shape of an other and of something given as against the form that as such stands simply in relation, you have reference, in relation, and whose determinateness is posited at the same time as reflective shine. So notice, the first way he puts this together, the first way he presents this is form content. The logic is about the form, the content is from elsewhere, right? And that leads a lot of people to say that we have in Hegel a division between the science of logic, which is all about this stuff, and the real philosophy, the philosophy of reality, which is nature and spirit. And those are about the content. So here's the form, and that's the content. And if you stop reading there, that's exactly what this passage sounds like it's giving you, right? The science of logic is all about the form, transparent to itself, doesn't have any otherness. And what's outside of it is going to be treated somewhere else. The only where else we've had to talk about so far is the philosophy of nature and the philosophy of spirit. Then look at what he says, and this is what I find most sort of interesting about what he does. He says, more exactly, come on, you're 670 pages into Hegel at this point. You know, more exactly means what I really mean to say is not the form-content distinction I was just giving you. More exactly, he says, the absolute idea itself has only this for its content. Here's what I really meant. I didn't mean to say it just had the form for its content. Right, that's a cute little locution. I got it. But I mean something more than that. What does it mean? It means this. The absolute idea itself has only this for its content, namely that the form determination is its own completed totality. Is its own completed totality. So it's like hermetically sealed into itself, right? It doesn't have. Is that what he's saying? Continue on. The pure, you have, is it still content? It's concept in German, so replace that. It's pure concept, not pure content. He says, now the determinateness of the idea and the entire course traversed by its determinants has constituted the subject matter, the object of the science of logic. And out of this course, the absolute idea has come forth for itself. Thus to be for itself, however, has shown itself to amount to this. And here's really what the science of logic is all about. Namely, that determinants does not have the shape of a content. Now, I don't know about you, but that's where determinants comes from. Right? Here's the shape of a book. Its determinateness is a matter of the content. The book, its greenness, its malleability or lack thereof, whatever. That's the content side, right? But the form, this book's got that form, that book's got, all of your books got the form, separable from content. The content comes from elsewhere. This is classic Kant, right? We all know that the categories are the forms of intuition, right? Because what happens? Intuition gives us in the content, the manifold, sensible manifold, and then it gets organized in accordance with the concepts, the categories themselves. That's the standard version of this. But he's just said, thus to be for itself, so this is the absolute idea, however, has shown itself to amount to this, namely that determinateness does not have the shape of a content, but that it is simply as form engendering its own content, form engendering its own determination. This is the logic. Right? So it's not just empty abstract form waiting for content to be added to it, whether that content comes from experience, sensible experience, or it comes from further determinations of the real philosophy, the philosophy of nature and philosophy of spirit. No, it has its own determinants. But that it is simply as form, and that accordingly the idea is the absolutely universal idea. It's universal precisely in that way, that it is everything. The concept is alles. The concept is everything. What is left to be considered here, therefore, is thus not a content as such. Kind of amazing, right? Everything else has been about form engendering content. That's really what the rest of the logic is. We look back upon it. It's all form engendering its own content. You didn't get it from without. It's not applied to anything. It engenders its own content, right? What entails that quality entails quantity. Nothing applied from without a quality. Quality entails its own transformation into quantity. Quantity entails its own transformation into measure. That's form giving itself its own determination. And that's the nature of reality itself doing that, not us supplying that in that way. So it's not an epistemic problem. It's not a cognitional problem. It's something that the form does of itself. It's an ontological movement. He says, so the only thing to be considered now, the thing that's left to us in this last few pages, is this. It's just not a content as such, but the universal character of its form. That is, method. And what is that method? Glad you asked, because he says on 737, it's just the movement of the concept. What else could it be? That's the form engendering content process. It gives rise to everything it is. But that's only been demonstrated at this point, at this juncture. So now, continue on with me for just a second here, and we'll take a break. First full paragraph down on 737. First full paragraph down on 737. So this is the method. So this last chapter is called the method chapter because it says, look, everything that is has been shown to be what it is. Not in all of its detail, but in its fundamental detail, its fundamental determinations, already in the law. We're done with that. All we have left to consider now is the form as such, the process on its own. Well, didn't we do that already in subjectivity chapter with the notion of the conceptual determinations and judgment and syllogism? And Hegel will say, no, that was a formal determination. It's not yet had its objectivity demonstrated. Well, didn't we do that in objectivity? Yes, we did, but again, that was limited there. It was confined within objectivity itself. So we need to look at it now purely on its own. That'll be the method, the way of knowing things. that will know things in their truth. So he says, first full paragraph down, 737, 238 in German. Accordingly, what is to be considered as method here is only the movement of the concept itself. We already know the nature of this movement, but it now has first the added significance that the concept is all, it's everything, and that its movement is the universal absolute activity, the self-determining and self-realizing movement. The method is therefore to be acknowledged as the universal internal external mode. Goes back to that language of mode again, right? But it's the weird mode, it's the different mode. It's not a particular mode, it's the universal covering mode. It covers all the others. Free of restrictions, and as the absolutely infinite force to which no object that may present itself as something external, removed from reason and independent of it, could offer resistance. Everything is what it is by virtue of this. Nothing that is can stand outside of it. Nothing can be left outside of it. Or be of a particular nature obstinate and could not be penetrated by it. It is therefore soul and substance and nothing conceived and known in its truth. So there's that language, knowing something in its truth. Unless completely subjugated to the method. It is the method proper to each and every fact because its activity is the concept. Now he's about to unpack those. And as we've talked about before, lots of people are disappointed by this account, right? Because it's just beginning, progress, totality. That's it. That's the movement of the concept, right? So he unpacks, that's the methodology. So what does it mean to subjugate everything to that? It means to see everything as a moment in that process, which he's been demonstrating all along. So of course it's going to seem anticlimactic at that point. We've been dealing with it repeatedly, but only now can we look at it on its own. Are we entitled to look at it on its own terms? So that's why method comes last, because only do we get to the form itself once we've looked at all the form determinations that concept is engendered. Let me leave it there. We'll come back. It's 4:33. Let's take a break. We'll come back and look at the method itself. Thanks.